This happened to me a few years ago, and this is probably the first time that I've had the courage to write it down. I cannot name the hotel involved, or there will be legal issues. I worked for a company which was based in Cavan, which is a county in Ireland. Our boss, for some reason, decided that he would surprise us all by organizing a Christmas party right in downtown Dublin City. We were all ecstatic about this, as for some reason this was very unlike him to do. He would usually be the type of person who would count how many tea bags that his employees would be using every day. You know, that type. We ended up going to a fancy steak restaurant, and then went on a pub crawl after that. After way too many pints, we stumbled back to the hotel in the early hours of the morning. We hammered on the door until one of the hotel staff members had let us in. We were about to head upstairs when another member of the staff marched over to us. He looked at us with a serious look on his face and told us not to leave our rooms between 3:15 a.m. and 3:30. I remember laughing directly in his face as we stumbled our way upstairs. Soon enough, I got back into my room and I turned on the television. At that point too, we weren't done, so I began drinking a few of the bottles that I had bought earlier before the night had started. I was enjoying them still, but they were a bit warm, as they had been in my pockets for nearly an hour now. I then remember seeing an ice machine just down the hallway, so I thought, why not? Might as well cool these drinks down a little bit. I glanced at my watch, and I saw that it was 3:23 a.m. And I smiled, thinking of that staff member's stupid rule. I mean, why would that even be a thing? It was so obscure. Anyways, I grabbed my key and made my way out the door and to get some ice. I was singing all the way to myself, and I didn't care if I was disturbing any of the other guests. As you could imagine, I was pretty bad by this point. I made it to the ice machine, and I quickly filled a glass with ice. After that, I began making my way back to my room, but my eyes, they kept being drawn to these strange pictures on the wall. They were of random families, all smiling away at the camera. I snorted at the thought that they all probably had started arguing with each other the second that the photo had been taken. I pushed open my door to my room and I felt my blood run cold as I looked at the spectacle that was unfolding inside. There was a man dangling from the ceiling by dozens of barbed wire chains that were holding him up in place. There was red liquid dripping off of him in numerous places, as the wire had cut into him pretty deeply. There was a woman and 2 children standing beneath him, and I almost threw up as the woman used a sharp blade to cut 2 thin strips off the man. She then nonchalantly threw them in the air, and the children snatched them up into their mouths. I took 2 slow steps backwards as I finally saw the children's faces for the first time. Their eye sockets, they were filled with insects, and their mouths were covered with rows of razor-sharp teeth. I watched as the food that they were eating, it was sliced and diced into tiny pieces by their razor-sharp teeth. The woman, who I assume had to be their mother, may have been beautiful at one time, but now had the look of pure malice on her face. Her eyes were deeply sunken, and her hair looked like it hadn't been washed in at least a decade's time. Her hands were terribly misshapen, and they now looked more like claws than actual hands. I locked eyes with the man, and I was horrified to discover that he was still alive. His eyes seemed to be pleading with me to help him in some way. I didn't know what to do, though. The woman reached out with her claw-like hands and tore one of his eyes out. She then placed them into her mouth, and I could hear that terrible popping noise as she crushed them slowly with her teeth. The man began to scream out in agony, and then she ended him with her claws. She stepped underneath and seemed to be showering in what was left of the man, as it now spurted outwards. Within moments, she was completely saturated by it. I stood there froze, not knowing what to do, but eventually I somehow snapped out of it. I began to slowly back up, in the hopes of somehow escaping before they spotted me. I heard a noise from behind me and realized that I had collided with the door. The woman's steely glare locked onto me, and she let out an awful, ear-splitting scream. Her two children, they lunged at me, and I barely had time to get out of the door. I slammed the door shut in their faces and heard repeated thuds from the other side as they tried to get at me. I started to run down the hallway, trying to find the elevator and get out of here and hopefully find some help. But my eyes were once again drawn to the pictures that were on the walls. Instead of the families from before, they now showed scenes that reminded me of the Saw films. I stopped in shock as I recognized the faces in one of those pictures. It was of my family when we were all much younger. It showed me sitting on a couch with my family also all around me, but everybody was missing their head. They all had a candle burning inside of their mouth, and it made it look like they were all smiling at me, like some sort of demented jack-o'-lantern. I smacked myself across the face to ensure that this wasn't a dream, and then I began moving once again. At this point, it felt like an eternity since I had left the room, and I was confused as to why I hadn't made it to the elevator yet. It had to have been less than even 30 seconds walk from my room earlier, but I had been walking for around 5 minutes at least now. I decided to try another room to see if there was anyone up here that could possibly help me. I picked a room at random, and I crossed my fingers in the hopes that there was salvation inside. I knocked on the door. I was disappointed when there was no reply. I was about to try the next door when I felt the door open slightly. There was nothing that I could see inside, so I pushed the door in further. The room seemed completely black inside, and the lights from the hallway didn't penetrate the darkness. I was turning to leave when I saw something move out of the corner of my eye in that pitch-black room. I thought that it might have just been a figment of my imagination, until I saw it move again. There appeared to be something crawling along the floor. I moved forward to get a better look at what was lurking inside. I let out a scream as I saw a giant black spider skitter across the floor. It was only at this moment that I realized that what I had mistook for darkness was thousands of spiders instead. They all began to crawl towards me, and I quickly slammed the door before they could overwhelm me. Some of them began to crawl underneath the door, and I tried to crush them with my feet. Their bodies began to excrete a yellowish liquid that began to burn through the soles of my shoe, so I had to rip them off before the liquid could reach my feet. The sounds of running feet began in the distance, and I looked around to find out where it was emanating from. Both ends of the hallway looked clear, but the footsteps sounded like they were nearly on top of me. I was surrounded. I spotted movement in one of the pictures on the wall, and I watched a younger version of myself go running through the picture carrying a blade. He then appeared in the next picture over, and then carried on along all the pictures on the hallway. I was waiting for him to reappear when I felt an agonizing pain in my shoulder. I spun around again to see the younger version of myself reaching out of the nearest picture with the blade. I had such a menacing look at my face that it didn't even look like it was me. I don't think it was me. He or me tried to swing it at me, but I jumped back. He gave me the most sadistic look that I had ever seen before running away once again. I heard the footsteps appear behind me, and I barely had time to react as he used another picture to try and get the jump on me. He had a look of disappointment on his face for a moment as he failed at getting me this time, and then he waved at me before disappearing once again. I panicked. I didn't understand what was happening. I began moving up the center of the corridor, and I was keeping an eye out on both sides of me in case he decided to try and get me once again. My legs were barely moving at this time due to total exhaustion. I was moving along step by step out of pure force of will. I stopped for a few seconds to get my breath back and to give myself time to think of an escape plan. After 5 minutes of not coming up with anything, I just decided to continue going forward. I tried to start walking, and I was scared when I couldn't move them. I looked down to see that my feet had begun sinking into the floor while I had been standing still. It was like I was stuck in quicksand. I twisted and struggled to move them, but my efforts were in vain as they were firmly stuck. I started to panic as I continued to sink through the wooden floor. The more that I struggled, the farther that I fell. I felt my knees pop as they made their way through the floor. I thought of all those stupid old movies that had a quicksand, and I let out a giggle that sounded manic in my ears. My waist had just disappeared when I heard noises from somewhere out in front of me. A very confused older couple stood there staring at me, as they had just stepped out of the elevator that had only been a few steps away. I screamed at them to help, and they ran forward and grabbed my arms and began to pull me up. I felt myself being dragged forward, and I let out a triumphant cheer when they managed to free me. But my happiness lasted only mere seconds, as the woman let out a scream before fainting. I started to weep, as they had only managed to free the top half of my body, while the bottom half had totally disappeared. I later learned that my legs had been found running around the floor below. It had taken the staff almost an hour to catch them, as they wouldn't let anyone near them. A number of the staff had ended up with injuries as my legs had lashed out at them while they were trying to subdue them. No one could explain what happened to me that night, and I wonder if anyone will ever believe my dark tale. If you read this, then please heed my warning and obey the hotel staff, as maybe their rules are there for a reason.